Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shaundra Watson, and I am a Senior Director of Policy at BSA, the Software Alliance, a trade association for the global enterprise software industry. Our members are leaders in providing AI-enabled B2B products and services used across industry sectors and around the world. We're very happy to be joined today by two legal experts at BSA member companies who have decades of experience working on technology policy issues. Daniela Combe, the Vice President of Emerging Technology Advocacy for IBM, and Scott Starbird, the Chief Public Affairs Officer at Databricks. Daniela currently helps develop and advocate for IBM's policy positions on emerging technologies, including AI, and she's worked for IBM for over 35 years in various roles, including leading global IBM legal team, supporting intellectual property and cloud. Scott also has served in various legal roles, including serving in various general counsel positions at Databricks and leadership and legal roles for investment banking companies. Both IBM and Databricks are leaders in developing open source AI and advocating for policies that support its continued use. And before we get started, a lot of people might be familiar with IBM, but IBM has grown and evolved over the years, and they may be less familiar with Databricks. So if you could just tell us, a little bit, like, what is IBM, what is Databricks, and what do they do, and how do they help other businesses innovate and grow?
Sure. So IBM is about a 112-year-old company or thereabouts. We are today a hybrid cloud and AI enterprise focused company. We serve about 4,000 or so, enterprise clients and governments around the world and operate in over 170 countries around the world. So a fairly complex environment to operate in, but our focus is really to enable our enterprise clients and partners in these core emerging technologies.
That's great, Scott. Can you tell us a little bit about Databricks?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, Databricks is a provider of a cloud-based, very high-performance data processing and hosting platform. And it is a very far-ranging platform in terms of what it does. We came out of open source. We were founded by the creators of one of the most important open source projects, Apache Spark. And then we've also launched a couple of other important open source projects from within Databricks, Delta and MLflow, and some smaller ones. So we've been involved with open source since the beginning. We're much younger than IBM. We were founded in 2013 and have been providing the platform since end of 2015, roughly. We're involved in really all aspects of the AI chain, from developing open source models ourselves through using other people's models to help businesses customize open source AI systems, et cetera, but also to test systems, customize them, monitor them, and productionize them. So customers run open source systems and AI systems built on open source on our platform. We're not as large as IBM either, but we are pretty large for a private company. We have over 7,000 employees. We operate all over the world with a number of large offices in EMEA and Asia, in addition to the US.
That's very helpful. And Scott, you mentioned open source as part of Databricks' origin in some of your activities. And both Databricks and IBM, have really done a lot in terms of developing open source. And I have a lot of questions about some of your involvement, but my first question is, what is open source AI? I feel like there have been a lot of conversations about the use of that phrase in the AI context, and that people mean different things. And sometimes they refer to widespread availability of model weights or the training data used to build the model. And so Scott, I can kick it to you. What do you mean when you refer to open source in the AI context?
Yeah, we look at the fundamental aspect of openness. We don't care about the technical definition of open source in the hardcore open source community. Basically, if it's freely available for no charge to at least virtually everyone, and applying that freedom and that no charge to both the code and the model weights, And then in addition, regarding the data is often publicly available data, but there needs to be at least a reasonable summary of the data that's used. And if those conditions are met, then we view it as open source, and we use the term open source or just open AI. There will be arguments with the purists over whether it's really open source or not.
Okay, and Daniela, did you have a different perspective on what's included in open source, or how we're using that term? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Scott alluded to this a little bit, which is that there is some debate around what open means in the context of AI and the AI models specifically. I definitely agree with Scott around, our view is that whatever it is, model weights, certainly certain information and transparency around the data sources, some of the core code. And then from an IBM perspective, the models that we have open sourced, our Granite models, some of which we open source, we put out under an Apache 2.0 license, which, our view is that it, to be truly open source, you should put it out under an open source type of license. So again, some debate out there, certainly, but that's our perspective.
And we see a lot of interest in these models. Can you talk a little bit about what the benefits of open source AI is generally?
Sure, I can start. I'm sure Scott can add to that. Look, I think at a high level, open enables innovation. The fact that you think about this space and what it takes in terms of cost and infrastructure to train models, that's only available to certain big companies that can invest in that. So now, if you can actually open these models up to a much broader community, you're going to get a lot more innovation and much more open exchange of ideas, and really the ability for a much broader set of eyes on what these models are from a safety and security perspective as well. And finally, I would say, the ability to develop skills in the area for academia to be able to play, and then good, healthy competition, in terms of kind of democratizing access is all, there are a lot of other benefits, but that's kind of the short list right now.
Thank you, Daniela. Scott, did you want to highlight any additional benefits provided by open source AI?
Yeah, first, I agree with everything that Daniela just mentioned. I'll add one that's a little bit unique from our perspective. Most of what we do in the AI world is to help customers in our B2B space in customizing AI models for use in their systems. That's much of what our platform is used for. And open source models give you a little bit more flexibility in that regard, because you can actually fine tune i.e. modify the model weights by training on additional data. And without the ability to do that with open source, you're much more limited in terms of the amount of customization that you can do with AI. So that's one area where open source is very helpful. And there's also the aspect that a lot of our customers are revealing, which is that when their proprietary data is used to customize a model, they have more control over that data, over access to that data with open source models. Even though they're open, once they're customized, the customer owns the model. It's their IP, and they have complete control over it. And that's an important feature. Just one final point, and these all interrelate, but the democratization of AI, I think, is really important. This is as much a philosophical thing as anything else, but being open makes it much easier to spread widely to underprivileged groups, to far reaches of the world where AI might not get as rapidly. And so some of this is a little bit nebulous, but we think it is actually important.
Daniela, IBM is known for its leadership on research. And so I was just wondering, is open source a factor in how it impacts scientific research, which is so important to the company?
Of course it is. I'm sure you're aware we acquired Red Hat, which is an open source company a few years ago. And we work very closely between our research colleagues and our Red Hat colleagues on open source models, certainly, but not just the models, a lot of the tools around the models as well. Prior to the craze around ChatGPT, we were already putting out some open source toolkits out of research around bias detection. and things like that. And that's just one example. Most recently, when we open sourced Granite, we also open sourced a toolkit called InstructLab. And InstructLab allows kind of what Scott was referring to, which is for a client or a developer that wants a level of control, right, to be able to add skills, add data, their own data, and customize the model. What InstructLab also does, and part of why we really partnered with Red Hat, is to create a community around the models and around Granite, so that the customer can decide, are these skills generic enough that they want to contribute back, right, to the underlying model, so that you're not forking the model over time. You're actually contributing to one thing that defines what the model is. Or do you keep it for yourself because it's some sort of competitive advantage? So it really gives that back to a word that Scott used, which is control, which is so important. And we did that out of research, and then we're partnering with Red Hat to actually have them put out a Red Hat AI platform around it. So.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. There's been a lot of policy discussions about addressing AI risks more broadly, and sometimes the distribution method comes up in those conversations. And one question is, how do you address AI risks in an open source AI context? And so I'm just wondering what steps that Databricks or IBM takes to ensure the safety and responsible development of open source models that it's developing. Scott, we can start with you.
Yeah, I can speak to both us as a developer of open models and also what we do on our platform to help customers. In developing DBRX, for example, we did a lot. We took a lot of care in selecting the data sets and in doing some filtering before training the model. We also did a fair amount of internal red teaming. And then we have conducted some reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, some rounds of that to further safeguard the model. On our platform, we have a lot of tools for filtering and testing and documenting and monitoring models on behalf of our customers. And so there's a whole range of tools that are used to look at the output of systems and to monitor them when they're actually in production, et cetera. And we do some of the same things that we did with DBRX development in terms of models that have been modified for customers.
Can you explain how RLHF provides additional safeguards?
Mm-hmm. Think of it as basically a multiple choice question. You ask a question of the model, and then a human looks at the answer and says, no, that isn't appropriate based on our guidelines, and that reinforces that contributes to the knowledge of the model, so that it is less likely anyway to generate a similar offensive or otherwise problematic output. And you do more and more rounds of this, then you can go back and fine tune the model to address it. Usually it's done in an iterative fashion. A round of it, as I understand from our research team, can take a week. It's a fairly expensive process. It's an important aspect. It's one of many tools that can be used to make a model safer.
Daniela, do you use similar tools, or are there additional measures that IBM takes?
Yeah, so similar to what Scott was describing in terms of things starting with with data curation, data filtering for hate, abuse, kind of speech. We do a level of filtering as well around, not using data that comes from known pirated sites that carry pirated information and things like that. Yes, then there is a level of testing that is done, and then we're quite transparent about what that level of testing is. I do want to add one point back to this kind of safety, and I alluded to this earlier as we were talking about benefits. I mean, my view is it's sort of similar to what we saw in the open source software world, right? Where problems can happen. But the fact is that you have so many more eyeballs of people who care about that particular offering in the market, that you actually find the problems and they get ferreted out much quicker. And so I think generally from a safety, yes, we as model developers do a certain level of testing, as we should, to a certain level of curation. But then when you put this out there in an open environment as open source, a model, you get a lot more eyeballs on it as well. And I think there's really a benefit from community action there.
So I was just definitely about to use the community word. Sounds like it's a community of safety that's pitching in. I was curious, Scott, you had mentioned something about safety tools being expensive, and I'm just wondering, do you think that's a barrier for smaller startups and smaller companies to implement safety safeguards?
Yeah, I think I was referencing RLHF in particular. It requires compute resources and human resources. So it's a lot of it is the time of expensive software engineers, frankly, that are typically used in it. Or if you use outside parties, that's very expensive too. So it is tough to develop various coded safeguards in addition to RLHF. That's expensive. Engineering talent is not cheap.
And there's been a lot of talk so the US, for example, launched an AI Safety Institute, and the UK has one, and there's one in Japan. The EU has an AI office, and they're hiring a lot of scientific and technical staff. And there's actually a conference in November in San Francisco among this international network of safety institutes. And one of the things they're looking at is figuring out like measurement science and how to evaluate the capabilities of advanced models. Do you feel like you have the resources and tools you need to ensure models are safe, or are there gaps, and are the safety institutes focusing on the right thing? Like, what's missing and what do you need to improve safety?
I think we all should acknowledge with some hubris, right, that the science is evolving. And so, and we, I think all of us in the industry should be very happy that there are groups getting together across the world, right, who are trying to come up with a common approach around what it means to test, and what those testing tools should look like, what the methodology should look like, what defines an appropriate approach. And I think it should be a public-private partnership, certainly, because I think we can add a lot of value to that discussion. The other thing I should note, and Scott, I'm sure would note this as well, we launched something called the AI Alliance about not quite a year ago to bring in a diverse group of companies, academia, government, et cetera, to focus on open initiatives, including open tooling, safety tool, and various things that the members want to see benefit in working on in somewhat of a collaborative way. With that, Scott, maybe you want to add any thoughts?
I'll just say that I support your comments. I think we are big supporters of research as well. I will say that in our world, we're B2B. We don't have consumer facing models, so we don't focus on some of the same risks that a company with consumer facing models might be more inclined to spend a lot of time on. But we have done a fair amount of research. We've developed something called the Mosaic Gauntlet, for example, which is a tailored collection of benchmarks. I think it's evolving over time, but to look at mostly at accuracy, but it also looks at bias as well. And we have some bias filtering tools that we've developed. We think more research in those areas would be phenomenal and are very supportive. And we are, as Daniela mentioned, we're members of the AI Alliance as well, and very supportive of what that organization is doing in the open source world.
You mentioned earlier some of the benefits of OpenAI, and we've heard a lot of folks, a lot of stakeholders focus on risks, but sometimes they're not substantiated. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to tell us, what are the biggest myths about open source that you'd like to dispel?
Well, since you talked about risks, right? I think there's this myth that open models are inherently less secure, less safe than proprietary systems, and I think the NTIA report on dual-use models recently, debunked that. Right? It's basically they didn't find that there was that marginal risk. Again, saying we've got to keep an eye on it and keep looking at the science, but that the science hasn't shown that to be the case. So that's one myth. I think there are certainly others out there. One is that you can't from a business perspective that open means totally free, and that like how do you make money and what's the business model? Clearly, between Databricks and ourselves and Red Hat, we have shown that there's clearly a business model around open. I'm sure there are others that Scott can mention as well.
Scott.
Yeah, again, I agree with everything Daniela said. We pointed out in our response to the NTIA request for comments on this subject that we view the biggest risk being the risk of concentration of power of AI in the hands of a few players, and open source addresses that risk rather than presenting a risk in that area. Sure, there's some risks, transparency. If there's bad information that isn't otherwise as easily accessible, it might be a little bit more accessible. But the approach of looking at the marginal benefits and costs, we think makes a lot of sense. Most of that information is out there anyway. And so you've got a very powerful tool that can be productively used to help people in many ways. Does it really make sense to restrain it and just to make it a little harder to get that information? I think on balance, it doesn't. And then you've got two huge advantages from open. You've got the transparency, effectively crowdsourced quality control, which can help with safety. And then you've got, in the case of customization, you've got the ability to control the data and prevent data leaks when somebody customizes a model for their own use with their own data. So when you look at the balance, we think on balance, open is actually, if anything, safer, or at least safer in some very important ways that make it very much worth keeping it thriving.
You both mentioned the NTIA report, and that's the report on open source that was required by President Biden's AI executive order. And that report, as you mentioned, essentially said the evidence is inconclusive to say that there are more risks than benefits for open source, and that the government should actually promote open source. But it also said, in the meantime, the government should monitor the capabilities of advanced models and then evaluate whether potential restrictions by the government should be put in place on the availability of open source. What's your sort of view about the last half of the recommendation that NTIA made? Daniela?
Yeah, I think it ties back to look, the science here is developing, continuing to develop, and these various whether it's NIST that focuses on science, right, as well as these various safety institutes that are looking at the science behind this. I think that's the right thing to do. I think you need to keep looking at this and focus on the near-term risks right now, and then kind of keep an eye on what's emerging so that you can address it as those risks become more real over time. So I think in general, we really were very supportive of the NTIA document, the report that they issued, and felt that it created the right balance at this point.
And Scott, did you have any additional views on NTIA's proposed recommendations?
Well, we agree with the conclusion that on balance, the marginal risk doesn't warrant restricting open models at this point. It's kind of logical that whether the report would have said it or not, that you want to monitor and do continued research. We appreciate their calling those things out, and certainly agree with it. I would hope that there's not a misinterpretation of the report, that there's some expectation that in the future open will be found to be problematic and necessarily shut down at some point. It's possible, but I don't think it should be concluded that it's inevitable. There was a lot of call for research in terms of the risk and the benefits from open. I don't want to fault them for this, but either in the report or elsewhere, it would be nice to see the government call for more research and support more research on looking for safety measures, that in particular safety measures that would be practical with open source models. And I'm not the expert to tell you whether those are even possible, but they should at least be looked into. And I think we, as collectively at Databricks, think that is something that's possible down the road.
Well, we can just close with a follow-up to that point, which is there was this aspect of the report that said the government should promote open source. And
Mhm.
so, my final question to both of you is, if you had a magic wand, what would you have policymakers do to actually promote open source development and adoption? And so one of the things you mentioned, Scott, is investment in safety research, perhaps in areas of bias or accuracy. Is there anything else that you would want policymakers to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of them, certainly I agree with Scott. I mean, sort of the government investing in all kinds of research around these technologies. But I think there's also something we want from a policy perspective, which is a focus on near-term risk and a risk-based approach to regulation as they're looking at regulation, as opposed to something that is focused on regulating at the algorithms. My little simple analogy I use is I said, if you use a screwdriver to put together the desk I'm leaning on, versus putting together, using it in the construction of an airplane, you're not going to regulate the screwdriver. And in the same way, if you over-regulate at the algorithm, if you focus on that, they're just going to get it wrong. And honestly, it will quell, the innovation and the openness, because people will have real concerns with it being able to meet, other than a few big companies, as Scott said, will be able to meet whatever regulatory hurdles are put in place that aren't necessary based on where the real risk is.
And Scott, did you have anything further to add to your earlier comment or to Daniela's comment?
Oh, just general agreement that I would like to see policymakers be careful about not imposing regulations that, even if not explicitly prohibiting open models, they don't, practically speaking, put up an insurmountable burden to open models. And also, it would be nice to have key policymakers be more vocal in a bipartisan way, wishful thinking, but about how they realize that open models, open AI, are very important and need to be protected.
Well, that's really helpful. And I just want to thank you both for your time and lending your expertise to this very important issue. And we look forward to continuing discussion and working with policymakers to advance innovation in this area and in this way. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Shaundra.
Shaundra.